All right, thanks a lot. I was initially undecided about whether or not I should wear my hat during this presentation, and I believe that Jason answered that for me. Okay, so here we are. This is the end of it, right? Good couple of days. Everybody's had a good time, learned a lot of stuff. It has confirmed for me something that I've believed for a long time, that we really are living in the incunabula period of the digital age. We're at that point in time where we are taking the technologies that we've been playing with for the last 20 years, and we're moving past the point of just using them to replicate the same old stuff, and we're starting to do some really new and interesting and exciting things. And all of us here are some of the luckiest people alive today because we get to be a part of this. Now, some of you have heard me say before, when I was in library school 30 years ago, and I learned about the invention of the scientific journal, I thought, how cool was that? And you start to imagine the cafes in Paris and the coffee houses in London and all these really bright caffeine-fueled people who are trying to use the very latest technology to reinvent the way science is done, the way knowledge is communicated, and I was jealous. I thought how great it would have been to have been alive in that time and to be a part of that. But now here we are. And we have capabilities and opportunities in front of us that if those people could see us, they would be so jealous of us. It's a great time. Now there's challenges, obviously. Some of them are technological, but I don't actually spend a lot of time thinking about the technological side. It moves so fast. You think about what's happened just in a couple of years. The technology is really becoming mature. And as we figure out what we really want to do and what kind of a world we want to create, I have confidence that the techie people will develop the kinds of tools that will get us to where we want to be. So I tend to spend more of my time thinking about the cultural and social issues, because to me that's more challenging and more important. And if you think back again to the incunabula period of print and what had to happen to move us from the middle of the 15th century into the middle of the 17th century, the technology was the easy part. But then there was this whole host of social changes and legal changes and cultural and government and law and all of this that had to happen so that we could figure out how to take these technological tools and really use them to create a robust and strong print culture, the culture that we all grew up in. And so now we're at the point where we are facing those same kinds of challenges. I think what Jason was just talking about is a key feature of that. How do we develop the kinds of structures that make sure that we're using the technology right, that we're using it to create a world that lives up to the potential of all of the technology? In the initial incunabula period, one of the great things that happened was the invention of so much of what we have. Authorship, the whole notion of what authorship is changed radically. Publishing was invented. What librarians did was completely flipped on its head. In order for all of that to happen, it required bright and innovative and creative people to really be willing to kind of open up and listen to others and learn from each other and really be willing to rethink what their role was. And that is absolutely essential for all of us now. But at this very critical time, we've got this weird rift between publishers and librarians, two communities that are key players in this. Fred talked about it at the opening session when he came out of science and became a publisher. And why are all these librarians saying all these nasty things about me? Where does this come from? Now, I'm a librarian who has spent much of the last 15 years kind of strolling around in the publishing space and meeting people and learning from them and really trying to understand where this comes from and why we have this weird tension that gets so nasty. It gets so angry and where we say really mean things about people. Because as I've gotten to know people in publishing, I find so many of them are driven by the same goals and ideals and ideas as I am coming into librarianship. I don't think we're that far apart. But you read the blogs and you read some of the stuff that's out there and you would think that we were miles apart and we're at each other's throats. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is just offer some reflections about some of the things that I've observed, some of why I think that this has happened, and some of what I hope we can do about it. Now, I was in Cape Town, South Africa last June. I was at the International Publishers Congress. And this is several hundred publishers from all over the world. And it's all kind of publishing. So it's the STM stuff that I spend most of my time worrying about, but it's trade publishing, K through 12, journalism, all kinds of stuff. Fascinating people all over the world. Great speakers. The keynote speaker starting out was the great Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Closing speaker was the brilliant South African editorial cartoonist Jonathan Shapiro. And they talked about the struggles they'd gone through: imprisonment, banishment, risk to their lives, to their families, in order to do the work that they believed in. And they told stories about the publishers that they had worked with, who had taken many of those same risks, without whom their ability to share knowledge and to protect free expression would be impossible. And I'm sitting there in the back of this auditorium in Cape Town thinking, I'm in a room full of idealists. Knowing that if I go home and I talk to my American librarian friends and say, yeah, I was in a room with hundreds of publishers and I was in a room full of idealists. Right, they would say. Because that's not how we view each other. Why is that? So I think, okay, librarians are this group of talented professionals just fiercely dedicated to making sure that information is exchanged well and throughout, because we believe that it's essential for the protection of a civil society. And we believe that market forces create the major barriers to making that happen. Publishers, on the other hand, are a group of talented professionals fiercely dedicated to the notion that the effective exchange of information among people is essential to the welfare and well-being of modern civil society. This is true of the people in publishing that I know, and they believe that market forces are the means to achieving that end. So we want the same stuff to happen. We're in it because we believe in the importance of what we do. But we have this diametrically opposed view of the role of the market, and so it leads us to create these caricatures. Publishers only care about the money, and librarians are hopelessly and willfully naive about what it takes to actually make society work. And because we create these caricatures of each other, we can't even have a real conversation. We're squared off in our corners, looking at each other through this lens of caricature. I had another little insight. Earlier this year, I spoke at a pre-conference to the Professional Scholarly Publishing division of the AAP, and they had this session on communicating the value of publishing. Publishers are realizing that they need to do a better job of talking about what they do. And so this whole thing was about communication strategies and who are your audiences and how do you tell your story and all of this. And so it got into social networking, of course. How do you use that? And it was clear pretty quickly that most of the publishing people in the room were really uneasy about this whole social networking thing. And it was exemplified by a question from the audience. The guy who was speaking is a senior executive with one of the big publishing houses, and he was talking about how they are working to develop their corporate Twitter strategy, which is a strange phrase to begin with. And so the question was, so how far down into the organization do you allow people to tweet on behalf of the company? And the answer was, well, not very far. And it was very clear that there were a couple of 2-3 well-trusted senior executives who were allowed to tweet on behalf of the company. But they had to because we know that this is really important. And I thought how different this is from my tribe. Because librarians, we love social networking. I mean, we're all over it, you know, the newest social networking tool, and we're there, and we don't worry about how accurate it is because we'll fix it later, and we're doing all this outreach, and it's great, we love it. How different our attitudes are, and I'm trying to think, okay, why is that? And then again, it makes perfect sense. Because what is the thing that publishers take the most professional pride in? It's getting it right. Whether it's working with the author, with how it's formatted, with how it's developed, the whole peer review process, corrections in journalism, all of that. What publishers do is spend huge amounts of time and energy trying to get it right before it goes out. The absolute antithesis of social networking. Librarians, on the other hand, we are not responsible for getting it right. We just want to get it out there. So, of course, we love social networking. So there's this tension between the quality and the quickness. And again, it leads us to create these caricatures that publishers want to lock information up. They're the enemies of science because they want to hoard this information and not let anybody have it. And librarians don't care about quality. We just want to get everything out there, and whatever it is that people do with it, who cares? So again, we can't have real conversations because we're looking at each other through these caricatures, which are not true. They do not represent the ways in which we actually think about the roles that we're taking. So I think, well, why does this happen? Because we are so intimately connected on the one hand. We see each other frequently. Our livelihoods are dependent on each other. So why do we create these caricatures? And I think it's because for all that we connect, we very rarely communicate on the level that we need to. If you look at conferences, it's like we exist in these parallel worlds. We're in the same place at the same time, but we're in different dimensions. I'm reminded, some of you know the C.P. Snow's 1957 book on the two cultures, where he talked about this split in modern society between science and the humanities, who didn't interact at all, but who he saw as being absolutely essential to science. And I see the same thing between our communities. But if you look at where we go, with the exception to a certain degree of the Society for Scholarly Publishing conferences, because SSP really actively courts librarians as members, if you go to the major publishing conferences, librarians don't go to those. If you go to librarian conferences, publishers are there, but they tend to stay in the exhibit hall unless they're taking people out for dinner or for drinks. And then at the end of the evening, they'll gather with their friends in the bar, probably complaining about the crazy things that librarians have said and want them to do and why they don't understand their business. Where down at the other end of the bar, there's the group of librarians sitting around and saying awful things about the publishers, who might have bought them dinner earlier in the evening. And even here at UKSG or at the NASIG meeting or Charleston, which are the big meetings where we all come together, we still don't have that kind of real, open interaction. Too often you listen to a presentation and it's like it's really being delivered to just one segment of the audience. And it's that buyer-seller relationship is always there. And so the librarians are always free to ask questions or make comments that are extremely critical of what publishers are doing, and the publishers are sitting there biting their tongues because they don't want to say something that might offend a potential customer, even when what that customer is saying is inaccurate at best. And so we are ignorant. For two communities who spend so much time with each other, we know so little about the worlds that each other actually operates in day by day. It's fascinating to me. I've had the opportunity over the last few years to participate in a number of sessions where we've gotten a group of librarians together and just brought in people from publishing to ask questions. So instead of librarians telling publishers what we think publishers should know, publishers get to ask librarians the stuff that they want to find out. The librarians have to answer. A couple of things that fascinate me about these sessions. One is the eagerness of publishers to participate. Every time I've done this, the room's been full and we could have gone on longer than we did. The other thing is that the nature of the questions really indicates to me that the view that the publisher has of the world that I really live in is really quite narrow. And it's certainly not the way that I view my world. For example, My library, the University of Alabama at Birmingham, Lister Hill Library, we are one of the larger academic biomedical libraries in the US. So I've got 40 people who work in my organization. Probably no more than 5 of them actually spend their days worrying about the acquisition and organization of content. Maybe 5 out of 40. The rest of my crew is involved in one fashion or another, working with the members of my university community, faculty, staff, students, the researchers, the clinicians, in helping them to integrate information resources into their working lives, into the things that they need to do. So I, as the director, am actually spending relatively little of my time worrying about the acquisition and organization of content. I am focused on all of these other activities. But if my publishing rep comes in and sees the library as primarily an organization that acquires and manages content, the view of that person is really different from my reality. And it makes it really hard for us to really communicate in a way that makes us effective partners. And of course, librarians' ignorance of publishing is legion. You hear the line all the time, you know, publishers get the content for free and peer review is done for free and blah, 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 and we buy it back and et cetera, et cetera. Speaking of caricatures. I was recently appointed to the editorial board of the British Medical Journal, as an example, and I was in London 2 weeks ago for the editorial board meeting, 2 days. Again, the only librarian in the room, which seems to happen to me a lot. And there were some people from the publishing side there. But mostly it was the editorial staffs, this group of professional, well-paid editors who cost money to do what they do, and the editorial board members who are physicians and researchers and clinicians, talking about, for 2 days, about what does it mean to be a top-tier journal like the BMJ in this day and age, and how does the journal interact with the other products of the BMJ group, and what kind of infrastructure do we really need, and what does it mean when the article is disaggregated from the journal, and how do you develop a brand strategy, and how do you interact with patients, on and on and on, this incredibly rich and complicated discussion about how just that one journal is trying to deal with how it meets its responsibilities to society, so different from that caricature view that so many librarians have about publishing. And I worry sometimes for my tribe that in this myopic focus on freeing the individual article, we want to turn publishing back to a 17th century cottage industry where we miss the chance to create this incredibly rich and detailed and complex infrastructure for communication that really takes advantage of all of the digital tools that we have within our grasp that can do so much more than an individual article can do, but that is complicated to build, that is expensive to build, and that is going to require the concerted effort of all of us to really put together. The Chicago Collaborative, which some of you know of, was created to try to address this, to try to create a trusted space where librarians and people from publishing could actually get together and talk about what they had in common. It's primarily biomedical, primarily American. The STM Association has started a library advisory group that is attempting to address, to create similar sorts of discussions. And I think the most important thing that I've found over the 4 or 5 years that the collaborative has been together is that when you get people from publishing and librarians together in the same room and you push that buyer-seller relationship out of the way and you start to actually create a trusted space where people really do feel free to talk about the things that are of the most concern to them and the challenges that they face, we have so much more in common than what separates us. So I think that developing that kind of knowledge is critical. It will make us better negotiators. It'll make us better partners. It'll make us better collaborators if we really gain a much deeper understanding of what it is each group is trying to do and the challenges that we face. What it won't do is make us agree on everything. That's okay. I mean, I can admire the people in a particular publishing company for their skills. I can be friends with them. I can go out and have drinks with them. And I can still think that their particular way of dealing with a particular aspect of their business model is terrible. But I can tell them that. And I can work with them and I can explain why I think it is, and maybe we actually learn something from those conversations, and maybe they change their model a little bit. Or maybe I am enlightened and realize, oh, now I see why you're doing it that way. That kind of makes sense. Maybe I still don't exactly like it. But now I'm in a space where I can work with you more effectively and hopefully find a solution that actually works well for both of us. That's hard. But I think that that's the direction that we need to go in. So what I want to kind of leave you with as we leave the conference and you go off to wherever you're going and you get back in your day-to-day thing and you think about the people that you spent time with, I want you to think about your role and how you interact and how you can do a better job of helping to create that future. So for librarians, just cool it with the emotions. These are business decisions. I mean, I've been hit as bad or worse than any other librarian. We've had huge budget cuts. I've had to make massive cuts in our content. There's a lot of stuff that I think my community needs that I can't afford. And I worry about that, and I work at that. But I know that I'm in the situation I'm in not because publishers are evil people who hate librarians and hate science. Maybe it's emotionally satisfying to feel that way, but it is not helpful. Attend some publisher conferences. It would do librarians good to spend time really listening to what publishers worry about when they're getting together with their colleagues and trying to invent the future. Be willing to be educated by your knowledgeable faculty. One of the things that drives me nuts is when librarians go out and say, we have to go out and educate the faculty about scholarly communication. When there are on your faculties authors and editors and chairs of publications committees and executives in their professional societies who know a hell of a lot about scholarly communication. Now, there's a lot of stuff that we know that we can share, but let's drop a little bit of the arrogance and spend some time with the people on our campuses who also know a lot, who, again, we may not agree with on everything, but who we need to figure out how to engage with and become partners with. And it wouldn't kill you to buy a publisher a drink every once in a while. Publishers, you are lousy at telling your own story. It's kind of ironic, isn't it, for an industry that's based on communication? You are terrible at telling your own story and expressing what your value is. It's getting better. I know that there are some efforts among some of the publishing societies to do a better job of doing this. It is going to require that you become more transparent. And I know that that's hard. You've got competitive issues that you need to deal with. There are regulatory issues that you have to deal with. But it's essential. I mean, if we're going to create a more trusted space, you're going to have to be more open about your mission, about your decision-making, about why you do what you do, about where your pricing models come from, about how you are trying to maintain a healthy company and also engage effectively with the other parts of the scholarly communication community. Cross-ref is a great example of what can happen when publishers figure out a way to come together. So it can be done, but it's challenging. And when you go to the library conferences, go to some of the sessions. Sit in on some of the sessions, and again, listen to what librarians are really talking about and what they're really focusing on when you're not just having the conversation about content and price. So I go back to where I started from the beginning. I tell my library friends, we are the most fortunate librarians in at least 500 years because we get to be a part of this. This is true for publishers. This is true for the rest of you in this room who all play critical roles in this chain. This really is our Gutenberg moment. We have the chance to do something that is as significant and profound as what Oldenburg and his colleagues did in the middle of the 17th century. but it will require the willingness and the openness to understand that everybody in the room, from whatever perspective you come from, is somebody of goodwill who shares your values and who is needed in making this happen. And I really hope we don't screw it up. Thank you.